Patience as we do a transition to the last session of our conference this year. And I promise that we will get you out on time, and glad that many of you were able to stick around. So now that you've heard a little bit or a glimpse into the possible future of PKU and possible therapies that may be available down the road, we did want to end by talking a little bit more about the clinical trial process and what that means. And so we have an incredible panel here for you, and I have some questions for each of them as we conclude the session, because obviously, as you know, patients, right, are at the crux of trials, and we need patients to participate. And all of the companies that were just up here are also very interested in hearing from the patient community in terms of what are the most important things that we want to see in new treatments and symptoms that we want to alleviate. So starting down to my right is Dr. Petrulu Sabuku, who is the lead medical officer in the Division of Gastroenterology and Inborn Error Products at the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Dr. Suyash Prasad, next to her, is a member of the NPKUA Board of Directors and also serves as Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Audentes Therapeutics. Of course, we all know Dr. Harding, and he has many titles, including Magician, Chair of the NPKUA Scientific Advisory Board. You heard about his role as the lead principal investigator for the approval of Palynziq, and he's also the professor of molecular and medical genetics and pediatrics at Oregon Health and Science University. And then we have Amy Oliver, who is the NPKUA board president, mother of 3 children, 2 of whom have PKU. Amy lives in Salt Lake City. She will talk from a parent perspective on why she chose to enroll her children in a PKU clinical trial. And lastly is Linda Sywin, who is an adult with PKU that lives in Florida. And she will talk about her experience as an adult in participating in a PKU clinical trial. So the first person that you're going to hear from is Petrula. And I mean, you know, she's the FDA, right? So perfect expert in order to give us a brief overview of the clinical trial process and what that is and what it entails, and also the FDA's role in the process. So I'm going to have her start by just giving that general overview. You can stay there, yes.
Can you hear me? Hi, thanks, Christine, and really thank you very much for the invitation to this conference. This is really a tremendous effort from the organizers, so thank you for the invitation. As Christine mentioned, I lead one of the review teams in our Division of GI and Inborn Error Products at FDA, in which we are part of the review process and kind of involved in drug development in some way, which I will go into a little bit more detail, and specifically for drugs that have to do with inborn errors of metabolism, and of course PKU being one of those. So I was asked to give an overview, a brief overview of the clinical trials process, and also the role of the FDA in that, and I will give you kind of highlights of that in the time allotted, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. So I have to state that I really don't have any conflicts of interest, and anything that we'll discuss are my opinions and not those of FDA. So, you know, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about the clinical trial process, how it works, the different stages, kind of the general paradigm of going from animal studies to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies, which really the ultimate goal being submitting a package or an application for marketing of a drug or a biologic to the FDA. So, and everybody's familiar, the FDA is a regulatory authority really tasked with the job of reviewing and overseeing all clinical trials in humans in this country. And so, of course, there's specific regulations and laws that govern that, and I'm not going into a lot of detail of that. But basically, that's kind of the general framework that we work in. So in terms of the process, I will kind of highlight a few things from really the FDA's perspective of how that works. So I'm sure everybody knows that every unapproved drug in this country, or any investigational drug that somebody wants to test in humans, has to go through some review and opening of what we call an IND, or investigational new drug application, through the FDA. So the process being that the necessary information or data are generated prior to, quote, opening an IND or submitting a protocol for an IND to the FDA. And then what happens is the appropriate division, in our case, is our division, reviews the package that comes in. We generally have about 30 days to review what's submitted and make a decision of whether this trial or this protocol would be what we call safe to proceed with trials in humans. So the necessary data that I spoke about has to do primarily with animal studies, and you've heard a lot about animal studies. Those are done in either healthy animals, mouse, rat, monkey, or others, or animals who have been made or naturally have the disease. And so, for example, the PKU mouse, or there's actually an MPS or dog that naturally has the disease, in which there are studies done of the particular drug, either small molecular or biologic. So those are required to be done prior to any human investigation, and there's reasons why, and that primarily has to do with safety. So there's certain regulations and laws that kind of describe to sponsors, investigators, what specific studies at minimum need to be done in order to have a sense of what the safety profile may be of the drug before going into humans. And that makes a lot of sense because our primary concern would be with patient safety. So we want to ensure that whatever dose or dosing frequency or drug is being administered to humans, if it has not been reviewed before, ultimately would be safe in that patient. So in terms of this kind of, quote, preclinical studies, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with, they're either animal studies done in healthy animals or the model, and also sometimes in vitro studies. So in the petri dish, you're looking at cells, either healthy cells or cells of a disease model, or even a human who has the disease, in which there are some experiments done assessing different dosages or different dosage frequencies of the specific drug. The ultimate goal of that really is to assess what doses of that drug would ultimately produce a toxicity. So a toxicity really means that you have an adverse reaction or adverse effect that can be toxic and lead to severe manifestations or even death. And so usually those animals are dosed with doses that go up, and then the researchers or the investigators assess for any either clinical effects or clinical marker effects of the different doses. That gives a very good idea when it comes to IND review of what would be a, quote, safe dose to start with in humans, and also what the frequency would be of the dosing. But also it gives you an idea of what would be the potential risks associated with that drug when it goes into the patient. And also, are we able to monitor for those in a certain way? For example, it may be a drug that as you go up on the dose, it causes some kidney abnormality. Are we able to monitor for that, and how? Is that being done in the study in a certain way? and how frequently is that done? So, I think the role of the review in that sense, and all of the reviewers are medical doctors, physicians, is to really assess based on the evidence that we have to that point, do we think that patients who may be taking the investigational drug as part of a clinical trial would be in a place of safety while researching the safety and efficacy of the drug. So this is a general framework and kind of summary of the IND. And if there's questions, I'll be happy to answer. Then we get into kind of this life cycle of the drug, right? And so life cycle from our perspective means once you open what we call open an IND, then you do your trials, you go through your phases of development, either in traditional way or not. And I'll talk a little bit about that when it comes to rare diseases. But this kind of life cycle, FDA is also involved throughout this, and the role of the FDA in that is really twofold. I would say one is through guidance, so providing guidance to either companies, sponsors, investigators throughout a drug's development process. But also ultimately really is the review of a marketing application, which really kind of is the ultimate goal of all the programs, right? So, once you go through your different trials, this is a long process. And so at the end, you hope that if you are able to demonstrate that the drug actually works and it's safe enough, then you submit a marketing application to be approved for marketing. So, kind of outlining a little bit about this process. So the FDA's role in that is more of kind of overseeing and providing guidance, advice throughout the drug development, clinical development, which means that the sponsor, so we call sponsors the drug companies, investigators, anybody who really is leading and is responsible for a clinical trial. We get a lot of requests to meet with those sponsors, and really what this entails is discussions. So throughout drug development, there are specific details that has to do with the design of the clinical trial, meaning the protocol, which patients are you going to study or enroll in your trial, and why, and what are you actually assessing in the trial, in terms of both the efficacy piece and the safety piece. So all of those aspects are very complicated, obviously, and so throughout the drug development, the last thing that a sponsor wants to do is get to the phase 3 trial, the last trial, and not have talked to the regulatory authorities throughout to make sure that we're on the same page, right? And so all concerns or issues are addressed from both sides. We have seen examples where there are trials who are done out of the country, in Europe or others, and they're really completed. The whole trial paradigm, everything is completed, and then they come to us with a completed package. Well, that's too late. That's really very late. And so, especially in rare diseases, what we always say is because there's so few patients, and in PKU also, these interactions have to start from the very beginning, even before you file an IND. And so, and this is where also the patient input comes in, because we want to hear throughout the drug development about particular safety risks. What do the patients think about those? Would they accept those risks or not, for example? And for efficacy, we want to hear from patients if there is a change in a biomarker. Let's say there's field, right, and specific. Let's say we see, and that's a very simplified example, that the Phe level goes from 800 to 700. Doesn't matter to patients. Or if you have clinical, what we call endpoints, or when you assess clinical aspects of the disease when you give a drug. For example, you assess attention, or you assess depression, or you assess other symptoms on a scale or a questionnaire. If you have a score of 10, and then after, which means very impaired, right? Again, a general example. And at the end of the trial, your score goes to 9 or 9.5. What does that mean? Does that matter? We need to know that. And so that's where the patient voice comes in, the literature, the studies, and all of that. And so we take that into account, and that really applies to all meetings. And so what I was talking about earlier with Christine also is that the highlight of meetings for me with industry is when we have patients come in, because that's really when we hear, we talk about the science, we talk about the details, things that really don't quite make sense to a lot of people, but where you really come down to your bottom line is, well, what do you think as a patient? Would that make sense for you? Are we looking at the right clinical manifestations, or what we call clinical endpoints? Does that matter to you? Would a change of, 10%, 20%, what does that mean for you in your daily life? And so that becomes very critical in our review. And so we always encourage, and that's something that the industry actually would have to initiate and get the patient organizations involved, because they're the ones who request the meetings with us and organize the meetings and come to White Oak campus to meet with us. And so so that's kind of the process of meetings with us, and we're always open to having meetings, especially in our division in rare disease. We have a ton of meetings with industry all the time. So that's kind of one form of involvement in terms of guidance from FDA, and that can be face-to-face meetings, it can be written correspondence where we give advice on specific protocols or specific issues or questions. Now, I wanted to touch upon a little bit about the actual review, right? What do we do when we review marketing applications? So, that's much less frequent, of course, than meeting throughout drug development, because it could take 10, 15 years for a drug to really come to a point where the company is ready to submit the whole package, right? So it's a whole package of, we call those either NDAs, new drug applications, or BLAs, which is a biologic licenses application. That really depends on what kind of a drug it is. And so those are reviewed in very much the same way. And so the FDA's review, which may be different than other regulatory authorities' review, is we request all the raw data. So everything that's been collected throughout drug development has to be submitted for review. There's a thorough review that takes months to do. So there's two different tracks of a review, either a kind of what we call a traditional or standard review clock, or a priority review clock for certain rare diseases, and especially, in PKU in specific, and others, there's a regulatory authority that gives us the opportunity to provide a faster review, so that we call priority review. And that takes about 6 to 8 months of a review clock. And the reason why it takes so long is because we have to review all the raw data, including clinical data, the preclinical data, which is all the animal studies, how they were done, what dose was given, what safety monitoring was done, but also the chemistry and the manufacturing. And so it's a very complex process that involves many disciplines. So throughout this review process, really what it comes down to is assessing kind of twofold: the efficacy, of course, and the safety of the drug within the regulatory context, but also within the context of the disease itself. At the end of the day, what the reviewers really think about after you look at the raw data and everything, you have to put it in perspective in the specific disease. First, when it comes to efficacy, does it matter? Does the effect that we saw in a particular marker or in a particular clinical effect, what does that mean for the patient? Is it something that's clinically meaningful, clinically useful? If we deal with a biomarker, so for example, in PKU, the FDA has approved drugs based on reduction on the blood Phe level. So in order to do that, there has to be certain evidence that reducing that level really translates into some benefit. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense to approve it based on that. So we review all those data and try to also put it in the context of the safety of the drug. So per the regulations, and I'm not going to bore you with regulations, is a safe drug is truly a drug in which the safety risks are outweighed by the benefits of the drug. So there's no drug that has no side effects. We all know that. And so in order to approve a drug, it has to be, quote, safe, meaning that the benefits that you've shown through the clinical trials have to outweigh the risks that you've seen in terms of the safety. And that we call this benefit-risk framework or benefit-risk assessment. That's really what it comes down to at the end of the review. It's a complicated process. That's why there's physicians and clinical scientists who review all this data. In inborn errors of metabolism and rare diseases, that becomes even more important because we know those are serious, they're life-threatening, they're chronically disabling diseases, PKU being, of course, one of them, and so everything goes into the context of that. We also know that patients who have serious and life-threatening diseases, by and large, tend to accept more safety risks, and we've heard about that. We hear about it all the time. That's where the patient input comes in. FDA really, truly incorporates that into the drug review process, and even more now with current, recent regulations, where we're actually required to incorporate a part of the review, the patient voice or the patient perspective. And how do we do that? In our reviews, and those are publicly available, you'll be able to see that on how we incorporate that. An example was for the recent Palynziq approval. So I know that we've met with the patient community, the investigators, quite a few times, and the company throughout the review process for Palynziq. And that gives us really a very good idea and better sense of really what do the patients want in a new product, but even more importantly, what risks are they able to tolerate? And that becomes very critical in the review. So in terms of, I guess, other general things of the FDA's role, I would say it's guidance to industry, it's review, but also the patient component has become even more of emphasis, and especially recently. So that's incorporated now into the regulations, but I feel it's really always kind of been echoed, even though it hasn't really been in the regulations in the FDA. So there are meetings that can be requested by patient organizations. We've had those. Those can be general discussions, scientific meetings, listening sessions where we hear about, what really matters to patients. Are the current therapies enough? What are the issues with current therapies? For example, we have biologics approved for different rare diseases where immunogenicity is a big issue, allergic reactions are a big issue. Those are given via an IV infusion, and so there are patients who really don't prefer not to take this drug because it means a lot of cost, and it means traveling to an infusion center every so often. It means risk of anaphylaxis and things of that sort. So if that's the only approved drug for a certain rare disease, there's obviously an unmet need for just more kind of efficient therapies, but also more convenient therapies. So those are things we'd like to hear about, and that really guides our thinking when we review the different drugs that come into our division. So in terms of requests, we're always open to listening, and I feel that's even more important in rare diseases because there are just so few patients, but there's also so heterogeneous that you may have a patient with a very mild disease. You can have a patient all the way to very severe disease who potentially would not be expected to live past the age of 2 or 5. So that really spans the spectrum. And unless we really hear up from the patients and their families, we don't have an opportunity to put everything in context and really instill this framework in our review. Now, some of us have the, I guess, fortune to have come from a background. For example, I'm a clinical geneticist, so I do have a background of, understanding really that, but many others at FDA don't. And so you'll see cardiologists review, drugs for allergy. You'll see pulmonologists review the others. It just happens. And so in that space, it becomes really important to hear from the patients and kind of learn about their disease. So that has to do with meetings with patient groups. I know we'll be incorporating that, and there's a shift in the agency to really incorporate listening sessions, which we would highly encourage. And I think I'll end there. I think I talked enough, and I'll take any questions either now or later.
I'm not sure if, oh, it is on, great. I think what I'd like to do is move on at this point, and hopefully we'll have some time for some questions and discussion. I know that Suyash, you're up next, and you have some slides. Sure. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So while they're pulling up those slides, what I asked Suyash to address was his overview is really from an industry perspective. And, where Suyash works, they are not working on PKU. But I wanted him to include, information, from an industry perspective, including, what is the time involved in a trial? What costs are involved? How do you, decide whether or not to move on? Or, when you come up against challenges, when do you decide that no matter what you do, that you don't think those challenges can be overcome? And then I also asked him just to touch upon any advice he has for patients in considering trials.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Christine. Thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name's Suyash Prasad. As Christine mentioned earlier, I sit on the NPKUA board. I'm also the Chief Medical Officer at Audentes Therapeutics, and we develop gene therapy approaches to treating rare and severe diseases. I did spend some time at BioMarin a few years ago working on we called it PEG-PAL then, it's now Palynziq. And so was one of the large army that Carrie alluded to previously, so do have some experience in PKU as well. So at Audentes, we have a number of programs in development. We have 2 programs in clinical trials, and we're based in the Bay Area. But I'm not going to talk about Audentes. I'm going to talk about the questions that Christine posed to me. And the two specific questions you mentioned to me previously were cost and time. Very simply, it's very expensive and it takes a long time.
And we're done.
So that's the general upshot. But I'll go into a little more detail. There's obviously a lot more nuance to that. I'll touch on the drug development process. I'm going to touch on what needs to happen in order for a clinical trial to start. And also, from your perspective as potential participants in a clinical trial, I'll touch on what you might want to consider before thinking about taking part in a study. And I can also give you an example of what we're working on specifically. And, a big important concept is this idea of translating what we observe in a clinical trial, the clinical measures and the scientific measures, into what's meaningful for patients and families. So I can talk about how we are doing that in our programs. So this is the process for developing a medicine, and it was really interesting to be here earlier in the morning hearing all the different approaches by a number of different companies at various stages of development. And each company will be at one of these levels. Obviously, Palynziq is now at the bottom, where I anticipate there'll be some post-marketing studies as part of this REMS program. But obviously, Albert from Homology talked about how they're doing IND-enabling studies. So these are the studies that are done just before you can start clinical trials. But essentially, things start off in the lab. You make a small amount of product. You do some proof of concept work in animals. You do some IND-enabling animal studies to allow yourself to get into humans. You then do a proof of concept study in humans while simultaneously trying to manufacture at larger scale. You then, once the studies have been run, file the data with the regulatory agencies. We've just heard a little bit about that process now. Hopefully you get a regulatory approval and then can commercialize the product and perform some post-marketing studies. And the arrow on the side of the screen does show many years and lots of money. When I say many years, you're thinking, this process is at least 10 years. You heard that, the original idea for PEG-PAL was using the PAL enzyme was in the 1960s, and so this can take a long, long, long time. And lots of money. We're talking millions, tens of millions of dollars. So what needs to happen before a clinical trial in humans occurs? Well, you've got to be able to make sure you can make the drug. And once again, Albert touched on this earlier. It's really critical from a company perspective to be able to make enough investigational product at high quality in a consistent manner on an ongoing basis. The worst thing that can happen is you start a clinical trial and you run out of product. So it's really important for the company to really set up their manufacturing in a way that can do this. What else must happen? We need to learn as much as possible from the preclinical animal work. In particular, you've got to think a lot about how reflective is the animal work going to be in the human situation, but also how translatable are the findings in the animal to the human itself. You need to design the clinical trial and think about how you're going to run it. So there's a scientific piece to run the clinical trial. There's also some pragmatic or operational considerations. So from an operational perspective, you have to think about where will the trial take place. Is it just the US? Is it the US and Europe? How many trials? Which countries? Which centers? Which specialists? You need to make sure that the setup at each clinical trial site is appropriate and comprehensive. You need to make sure that the centers can run complex studies. Ideally, they will have some experience in running studies, and often there's specifics to the particular clinical trial that need to be addressed at each site. So, for example, with gene therapies or with biological therapies such as Palynziq, you need to be able to handle biological therapies in that particular center. In addition, from the company perspective, from the industry perspective, we need to make sure we've got enough people to run the study. We need to make sure we've got enough people in the regulatory group who are handling discussions with IRBs. We need to make sure we've got enough operational people to help the clinical trial sites. We need to make sure we've got enough physicians to make sure we partner with the principal investigators and make sure we've got enough biometrics and data management staff to build the databases to analyze the data. So there's a whole infrastructure that needs to be built in line with a clinical trial. What scientific decisions need to be made? Well, you need to think about how many patients will take part in the study. We're running an experiment. It's not a treatment, it's an experiment. And so you want to expose the least number of individuals to this investigational product, but enough individuals so you can prove or disprove your hypothesis. And so statistics plays a big role in how you're thinking of powering the study. You need to think about whether there'll be a placebo control or not, and if you're not having a placebo control, what's the comparator going to be? You need to think about who's going to be included in the study. Is it adults and children? Is it just adults? Is it adults who have a particular degree of severity of the disease? What safety monitoring will be performed? How often do you need to do blood tests? And importantly, what endpoints will be selected and what tests will be done? That's a key part of the study design, which feeds into the scientific pieces. And you hear a lot of discussion about endpoints, but an endpoint is an overall outcome that clinical trial aims to measure. So, for example, the obvious endpoint in PKU is Phe levels, but also there's clinical symptoms that need to be addressed as well. And diet is another potential endpoint. Can you increase the amount of protein, for example, you can eat whilst on a particular therapy? An endpoint must be clinically relevant, so a Phe level must be tied into what it means for a patient. Do they feel better? Is their health better? Do they live a longer, more active life? And an endpoint must also be responsive. And what I mean by that is that at baseline, the endpoint has to show some kind of deficit, but improve with treatment. So, for example, another example would be blood pressure. If you have a high blood pressure, at baseline, you want to see that come down with treatment. So something fairly simple. So what should patients consider? If you're considering taking part in a study, what do you need to think about before taking part in a clinical trial? Well, there are benefits and there are disadvantages to taking part in a study. So first of all, let's run through some of the benefits. It's an opportunity for you to gain access to a new research treatment before it's widely available. Now, it is research, it is an experimental drug, so it's not, you mustn't see it as a treatment, you must see it as an option, a potential treatment. And it's particularly helpful if your current therapies or your current treatments are not doing what needs to be done. And in the field of rare disease, it's particularly important because with rare diseases, often there are few options available to patients. It's also an opportunity to obtain expert medical care at leading healthcare facilities because usually studies are run at expert facilities. It's also an opportunity to help others by contributing to the field, contributing to medical research, and it's a way of you playing something of an active role in your own healthcare. In terms of disadvantages, there may be side effects. You've heard a little bit about that already. Earlier on, and they can be unpleasant, they can be severe, they can actually be life-threatening, of course, as well. Also, the experimental treatment may not work in you. It is an experiment. It's an experimental treatment that's being investigated. And an important thing to consider is how much burden being in the study is going to pose to you. There are many, many blood tests, many visits. You may have to travel a long way to get to a particular site. So all those things must be taken into consideration if you're considering taking part in a study. Who's in charge of your care? Well, it will be the principal investigator or the lead physician at the particular centre. There will always be a larger research team involved, study nurses, perhaps allied healthcare professionals, dietitians, physical therapists, etc. There will be physicians from the industry side also who have oversight of the study but will not necessarily have direct care of you as an individual. We would normally work with principal investigators and we have a bigger picture view of what's going on in the study. For example, if I was working with Carrie on the study and Carrie were to ring me and say, hey, Suyash, I've got this patient who I treated 3 weeks ago and they've come up with this particular side effect. Might it be related to drug? And it might be a conversation where I say, well, actually, Carrie, it's interesting you say that, but I've had 2 other calls from other investigators in other parts of the country over the past week with patients who have a similar side effect. So that helps build up a picture of causality and what the side effect profile of a drug might be. So that's how an industry physician would work with a principal investigator. And the other thing to be aware of is that if you're taking part in a clinical trial, you're going to be very closely monitored both for safety, from a safety perspective and an efficacy perspective. Another question we have is about privacy. Well, essentially, when you take part in a study, your privacy is incredibly important. The ethical codes, the legal codes that govern medical privacy in general all apply to a clinical trial also. And clinical research is federally regulated with a whole host of built-in safeguards. IRBs have to approve protocols. There is a formal protocol that has to be followed. And individual participants' names are kept anonymized that take part in the study. Also, if children take part in a study, there's another degree of complexity that comes along. Children have a different physiology to adults, which is important when you consider what the effects of the drug might be. So, for example, a child's heart rate tends to be higher than adults, a child's blood pressure tends to be lower than an adult. Those differences can be compensated for, but there are other differences. So, for example, the way a child may react immunologically to a therapy may be quite different to an adult. Some of that is a little less predictable, so you have to bear those differences in mind. Children are also growing, so you have to keep an eye on their growth and other aspects of development, for example, if they're going through puberty, and medications may affect children differently to adults. There are a whole host of regulatory considerations as well. So, for example, you can't run a study in a child unless there's at least a potential of some benefit to the child, which means it's quite hard to do phase 1 safety studies in children. You normally have to do that in adults before you move into children. And, of course, children can't consent for themselves, but it's important to get their assent. And parental expectations also need to be set appropriately. Once again, when you're involved in a study, it's not a treatment, it is a study. So you have to manage that expectation for the parents quite carefully, whilst also still retaining hope for the parent and family that this treatment may actually have some benefit for their child. So I can give you how do 2 minutes? Okay, I'll give you a very brief example of what we're working on at Audentes and how we're trying to build this link between what we measure in a study to what's clinically important to a patient and family. So mytubular myopathy is a disease where patients lack a protein called myotubularin. This is involved in helping muscles move. So in the absence of myotubularin, these babies don't move. So they're born, they need to be intubated and ventilated immediately after birth because their respiratory muscles don't move, and they essentially need to be moved. They have no neuromuscular motion whatsoever, essentially. About 50% of them die before the age of 18 months, so it's a really terrible disease, and there's no other treatments for it. And now we can package the gene that produces myotubularin in a viral vector capsid and insert many trillions of these molecules into the patient, and we've dosed 6 patients thus far. In preparation for doing the study, we worked in partnership with many different stakeholders. So we had many discussions with the FDA and European regulatory agencies. We have a board of scientific and clinical advisors who have advised us throughout, and we've also spent much time with patients and families, which actually did help us in the design of the clinical trial. So when we asked patients and families what result would you like to see in your child, they really split their hopes for this treatment into two main buckets, so motor function improvement and respiratory function improvement. And what was impressive to us was the fact that we thought this was a neuromuscular disease, but they all told us actually it's the respiratory aspects of disease that are the most important to us. We worry about the ventilator failing and my child dying. So for that reason, we elevated the respiratory endpoint to being a co-primary with the motor endpoint. So, 30 seconds, okay. CHOP in 10 scores, which are a neuromuscular improvement. You can see the numbers go up dramatically. What does that mean for patients and families? What it means is that they can now, these kids can now roll over, have head control, and sit unassisted. So that's an example of changing a number to a milestone that's meaningful to patients and families. And on the respiratory side of things, the mean inspiratory pressure, which is a number, improves dramatically. What this means is shown at the bottom of the screen, which is where patients 1 and 2 have reduced dramatically their ventilator requirements. In fact, patient 1 has come off the ventilator totally.
So I think, Suyash, I mean, the most important thing that you're also trying to convey is that the endpoints that you've designed in this trial were based on direct input, correct?
Direct input from
patients and families.
patients,
From patients,
yes.
and what you found is what perhaps you thought was most important to them was maybe not what was most important to them, in some respects.
It's true. We thought that the movement, because it's a neuromuscular disease, would be the most important, but they said no, it's the breathing. So because of that, we modified our clinical trial appropriately.
Right. Perfect.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Carrie, I'm just going to turn it over to you for a few moments. And I asked Carrie to speak from a perspective as a principal investigator in a trial, and asked him to talk about what that role is, and how you work on finding patients as a principal investigator, or if that is in fact your role. And then really your own advice on what a PKU patient should consider as they look at participating in a trial.
Just briefly before I get to that, sort of more generally, I've just been sitting here contemplating about it's all about this risk-benefit ratio. And the thing I was thinking about philosophically is that's really the basis of medicine. I mean, everything that I do is a risk-benefit calculation. Whatever treatment I'm thinking about offering is a risk-benefit calculation. Everything that we offer has some risk, and hopefully the benefit outweighs it. Why is something investigational? It's because we don't yet fully understand what the risks are, and we don't yet fully understand what the benefits are. We can try to learn what the potential risks are from preclinical stuff in animals and get some idea what the potential benefits might be from animals. But animals are not humans, and we don't learn completely what those are until we just try it in humans. And the other problem that we have is in twofold, assessing risks. I have my concept of what it must be like to have a reaction to a drug, but I'm not the patient having the reaction. I'm not the PKU patient suffering with high blood Phe, so I also can't assess how much better they feel when their Phe levels drop. So I have a hard time assessing what the potential benefits are. So I'm completely sensitive to what the FDA reviewers are fighting and trying to understand what the full benefits are from having lower blood Phe. So, and in one way, I want to confess that I sort of echoing what Dr. Burton said last night, when I came into the field, it was like the dogma was that PKU had been solved. We had this diet, everything was fine. We didn't need anything else. And we've had to preach that for 70 years because that's all there was. And we had to convince the insurers and everybody else that they had to pay for the diet, and that's all we needed, and everything would be fine. And everybody in this room knows that's not the truth. But it's kind of like the literature ended with all of that. And so then when someone at the FDA has to assess our assumption, our statement that patients with PKU need something better, they look at the literature and they say, well, the literature says that it's all fine. So why do you need something else? And we have to try to show them that lower blood fee is better, and I feel better, and it's helping me immensely. How do we quantitate that? How do we show that to them? And that's really the crux of the challenge. And it's very difficult because partly we've been lax in collecting the information to show that before we ever got to trial, to doing these trials. So I still think we have work to do along those lines. I think that the Peg Valley's trial collected that somewhat, but I still think it's potentially more to do. We're now going into gene therapy, and I'll just tell you that in the gene therapy field, and I'm involved in one for the urea cycle disorders that we've dosed 6 patients for, and I'm very happy to hear about your data, which really looks exciting. It was a little easier to take risks there because that disease was life-threatening, and everybody understood that, it's easy to potentially give this gene-altering treatment for a disease that was potentially life-threatening. It's a little bit bigger of a jump to say, well, a disease like PKU, where you're not likely to die, is, worth taking this jump of, changing my genes in my liver. I personally think it's worth it, but others may not be quite ready to take that risk yet. And so that's a risk-benefit balance discussion that still has to happen. And I want it to happen, don't get me wrong. But it's a different discussion. Nothing about the risks in animals with gene therapy has really informed us very much about what happened in humans. So until it was done in humans, we learned a lot about what's happened in humans since those trials have happened, and the adeno-associated virus trials have been done in like 250 patients now, and we've learned a lot, but I still think there's a bunch more to learn. So again, this whole risk-benefit calculation is an ongoing potential issue. In terms of, back to your real question.
Well, actually, I think that, what you said is very, very important and very critical, and I think really summarizes what many of us are struggling with, as you look at PKU. So I think you said it perfectly, and that was a great way to use the bulk of your time, actually. Because we do want to hear from Amy and Linda,
Yes.
and I also want to be cognizant of people that still have to catch flights. So I'm going to actually turn it
That's
over
fine.
to Amy and Linda, because as you said, the patients are the most important, right?
Absolutely.
And then we will go from there.
So I have 2 children with PKU. They are now 9 and 11. But quite a number of years ago, we were approached by our clinic about a clinical trial for young children in Kuvan. And this was PKU 015. And my children at the time were 9 weeks old and 2.5. And we were asked if we would be interested in participating in a study of how Kuvan worked in very small children. And so a little bit of a different study. And when we looked at it, our first question as parents was, what are the risks? What is the potential benefit to our children? And, what could we expect to happen in the study itself? And I would say that when a patient is considering a trial, it's not just the risks and the benefits of the treatment itself, it's what I call the logistics. So what's expected of us? What do we have to actually do to participate in the study? And particularly for us, where we had very small children, how hard was it going to be to actually do the study? Our study was 7 years long, so it was a very significant commitment that we needed to make up front. And it was also a big commitment of time. I remember one of our very first visits, we had to spend about 9 hours in the hospital. And with an infant and a 2-year-old, spending any amount of time anywhere, even if you're at the zoo, is really hard to spend 9 hours in one place. And so, we had to think to ourselves, is this something that we think we can accomplish and that we can commit to? And one of the other things we had to think about was, what does it require of us on an ongoing basis? So it's not just the visits to the hospital, it's not just the visits to get blood collected, but we had to keep records and keep track of every time the children were sick. So you all know that little kids get sick all the time. So anytime they got sick, had a fever, they got hand, foot, and mouth disease, they got any number of childhood conditions, we had to keep records and keep track of that so that the folks running the study could look and see, were those related in any way to the trial. So it can be a really big commitment. It can require a lot of your time and your effort, and I think it's really important for patients to think about that and whether you and your family are able to take that time and commit to that. And I will say overall, the view of our family is that PKU is a really small world. There aren't a lot of patients and there aren't a lot of people, and this was our way of contributing to the future of PKU and helping advance that. And I think it was really important for us when we were considering whether to enroll our very small children, that we thought this can really make a difference for those new families and the families that are just barely coming into PKU when it's the most scary and the most frightening and the most life-changing. And that for us was a really important piece of it, about our decision to ultimately participate.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Linda.
Hi, my name is Linda Sywin, and I'm the youngest of 4 kids, 3 of which have PKU, including myself. I am currently on the pegbous injection, and I am very grateful because I am doing wonderful. I've been on it not quite 7 years, and the only side effect I ever had was a 10-day reaction in which they learned to give the drug a little bit slower instead of all at one time. Recently, I was honored to participate in speaking with the FDA about this drug, and I was honored to tell them how much we needed it and how wonderful it was and how wonderful it made me feel. I also told them that we deserve a normal life and that it's a very huge and important issue. I've actually been very proud to be on the ground level of this drug, and I'm very proud to actually see the ending of this drug. And for people who are thinking about doing this, I highly recommend it. As a patient that has had PKU my whole life, it's amazing how different I feel. I can do things that I couldn't do before. I can articulate things that I couldn't articulate before, and I actually can participate in things that I would never have thought I'd been able to participate in.
So Linda, I just want to ask you a question. And before I do that, one of the things that really struck me with Linda and in speaking with her is that you had told me at one point that one of the reasons why you decided to participate in this trial is that you wanted to feel normal and that you wanted children with PKU to feel normal. And as a mom who just had her 10-year-old 2 weeks ago start crying and saying, "Mom, I just want to be normal," I thank you and all of the adults in particular that have participated in trials for PKU, that my children can stand on your shoulders and hope to be normal and have a better life. My question to you is, as, Carrie alluded to, and Suyash and even Petrula, how did you decide to have this foreign bacteria injected in you? I mean, that had to be really scary.
When you have PKU, there's not really a lot that's even more scarier than that. As a result of the fact that in the early years when I had PKU, I actually have 2 retarded brothers that were not treated at birth. Currently, my eldest brother is on diet, and my other brother is also on the Pygmalion study. But for them, it's not going to help. And yes, I would love to see a study where it would involve children and help children feel normal. Because when I was a child, I never felt normal. Even though my parents never made me feel like I was different, the rest of the world did. And there's such a stigma when you go to school or you go places and your mom has to bring you your lunch and everybody is having hot dogs and hamburgers. And while at the time I really never thought about it, I've been doing a lot of thinking about that lately, and it's like we actually have a chance to make this drug available to everybody to feel normal. So when they approached me about this drug, it was still in the stages of being thought of. And my doctor and dietitian said, "Hey, Lynn, we got something that may help you. Are you willing to do it?" I said, "Absolutely." I said, "When it comes around, sign me up." There was no hesitation at all. I didn't know if it would work for me, and I didn't know if it would help me or not. But the fact that I could do normal things like eat what I want and feel normal and think better and concentrate and make decisions that I had to make was worth the effort and was well worth the problems that would come up with this drug.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can ask a question, and then we'll maybe have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience before we need to wrap up.
You were in the part of the trial where we tried to give maximum doses right away, and that made people quite sick quite quickly. We learned not to do that, and so that wasn't a pleasant experience. And so why did you decide to continue even after that happened?
What he is talking about is the 10-day reaction. I woke up on the 10-day, and their thinking originally was, we'll give her a whole bunch of drug, and it'll drop her feet. And it did. What they didn't count on is on day 10, I woke up with my hands and my feet so swollen I couldn't bend my fingers, and I could hardly walk. Immediately called my psych coordinator and made an emergency appointment to see the doctor. He gave me some Benadryl, an injection of Benadryl, took me off the drug, and started me on a drug again a week later, and did it slowly. After that, I've not had another reaction since then.
But what made you decide after that, when you had that bad reaction, to let them try again?
Because with any drug, there is some side effects, and I knew there would be some side effects to this one, and they knew exactly what to do and how to take care of it. It was a no-brainer for me. At the end result was doing what I can do now, like talking in front of large groups. I couldn't have done that without this. I wouldn't have been able to articulate my words, and things would have come out so differently. And I just knew that the more we learned about this drug, the better it would become, and the less other people would have to deal with what I dealt with. And I was okay with that. I've been a guinea pig most of my life with PKU, and what they learned from me will help somebody someday have an easy time of this, and with a disease that's not easy.
And I really think, actually, that we couldn't end on a more perfect note for the last 3.5 amazing days of meeting new friends and networking and finding other people who walk in our shoes. I'm just going to turn it over to Amy.
Time for one question, possibly, if I could. A quick question. First, before I ask, I'd like to thank all the panelists, and particularly Linda. But I have a question for Dr. Simpoku from the FDA regarding any requirements the FDA has following phase 3 trials for continued surveillance or reporting for adverse events. Is there a requirement, and if so, for how long?
So you're asking about post-marketing, basically after approving a drug, what are the requirements for reporting adverse events?
No, actually I'm asking maybe even prior to an approval or separate from the approval and marketing surveillance, following patients that are in a phase 3 trial, they conclude the trial, is there any requirement for the FDA for surveillance or reporting of adverse events after they finish the trial?
So that really depends on the specific drug, I would have to say, and really what it comes down to is whether the drug would still be in the patient's system. In a sense, whether you think if they develop something, like say 30 days after they stopped an investigational drug, if this is a drug that has a half-life or stays in the system for about 2-3 months, then it would be there would be a requirement for reporting. And so there's specific safety requirements that some in the companies I'm sure are familiar with in terms of reporting serious events within a certain amount of time and also unexpected events within a certain amount of time. But I would say after a patient completes a trial, depending on what the half-life or how long the drug stays in the system, and also what the protocol includes in the requirements for monitoring after that, I would think there would still be a requirement to report that to FDA. If there's more specific questions, we can maybe talk later, but that also probably depends on the case, I would say.
Thank you. So I just have 2 announcements to conclude the conference. In your conference program, we have a QR code. All of our conference surveys are electronic this year. You'll also be receiving an email with a link. We really, really look forward to the feedback that you provide us. It helps us design our next conference so that we can provide the content that you want to hear. And then the last announcement I have is the final tally from our Text to Give that we've been doing this weekend. We had 162 people make donations, and our grand total, which shattered our record in Salt Lake, I will say, is $34,367. So thank you so much. It's thanks to your support that we can continue to move forward and make the future for PKU a better one for everyone. And with that, please mark on your calendars the dates in July of 2020. We will be in Vancouver, Washington, the Portland, Oregon area, and we can't wait to see you there. Thank you all. Safe travels home.